Okay, so you want to secure a border. You draw a line on a map. You put a barrier on the line. You put cameras on the barrier. You put agents behind the cameras. And the flow stops. Money in, control out. It is the most physical, most intuitive thing a government can buy. Everyone can picture it. That's the appeal. A border is one of the only problems in politics that appears to have a shape. You can stand on it. You can photograph it. You can fly a politician out to a stretch of steel bollards in the desert and let them point at something solid. Unlike inflation or unemployment, it looks like a construction project, and construction projects have a price per unit. So many miles, so many dollars a mile, so many agents per mile. Fill in the numbers, sign the appropriation, and the problem gets solved in the order the money is spent. Here's the strange part. Almost none of that money ends up doing what the diagram says it does. You can spend $40 billion on a line and finish with more people living permanently inside your country than before you started. A smuggling industry that is richer and better organized than it was, and a drug flow that never went near the barrier in the first place. Not because the money was stolen, because the border is not a wall. The border is a market, and you have been buying the wrong side of it. Let's start with what you think you're buying. You think you're buying a mile of barrier. The advertised price is straightforward enough. Depending on the terrain, a mile of modern bollard fencing with roads, lighting, and sensors ran somewhere between $10 and $40 million during the last major American build-out, with roughly $15 billion converting into about 450 miles of new and replacement barrier. Call the working average $20 million a mile. That is your headline number, and it is the only number most people ever hear. But you do not buy a mile of barrier, you buy the right to build on a mile of ground, and that is a completely different transaction. In Arizona and New Mexico, much of the borderland is already federal, so the government is essentially handing land to itself. In Texas, almost all of it is private. Ranch families, farms, church land, a golf course, a butterfly sanctuary, plots that have been divided among heirs for 150 years until a single 100-acre parcel has 40 owners scattered across 3 countries, and 2 of them are dead with no will. Before a single post goes in the ground, a federal lawyer has to find all 40 and buy each fraction. Condemnation cases from a 2006 border fence law were still open more than a decade later. Landowners who were offered a few $1,000s ended up receiving several times that after litigation, and the litigation itself cost more than the land. So the price of a mile in South Texas is not the price of steel. It is the price of steel plus years of your calendar, and your calendar is the one thing an appropriation cannot extend. Then geography sends its own invoice. The Rio Grande is not a line, it is a moving river, governed by a 1970 water treaty with Mexico that prohibits building anything in the floodplain that would push water onto the other bank. So you cannot build on the river. You build a mile or 2 inland on the levee, which means the barrier runs behind American farms, American homes, and American land, leaving thousands of acres of your own country on the far side of your own fence. Now you owe those landowners gates. Gates need codes. Codes need to be issued and revoked, and gates that stand open during harvest are not barriers, they are doors. This is where the first trap opens. In remote sections, there is no road to the build site, so the first thing you construct is not the barrier, it is the road to reach the barrier. Then the road needs water trucks, and the concrete needs water, and in some stretches of desert there is no water within 30 miles, so you drill wells, or you haul it. Every mile of difficult terrain multiplies, not because steel is expensive, but because logistics in an empty place is expensive. The barrier is the cheapest object in the entire project, and once it exists, it starts costing money forever. Steel in salt air and blowing sand corrodes. Sensors fail. Access roads wash out in a single flash flood season. The life cycle maintenance estimates for a completed system run into billions over its service life, which means every mile you build attaches a permanent annual line item to your budget that no future administration can cancel without visibly abandoning something. You did not buy an asset. You signed a subscription and paid the first year in advance. Now here's the thing about barriers that the price per mile hides completely. A barrier does not stop anyone, it delays them. That's the actual product, minutes. A 30-foot bollard wall buys you somewhere between 2 and 20 minutes depending on the method used against it, and the methods are absurdly cheap. A cordless angle grinder with a metal blade, sold at any hardware store for a couple $100, cuts through a bollard in minutes. An aluminum extension ladder and a length of rope handles a 30-foot wall for under $300. Tunnels cost more and take months, but a tunnel is amortized over thousands of crossings. So consider the exchange rate. You spend $20 million a mile. The counterparty spends $200, and the $200 is reusable. That asymmetry is not a scandal. It is the physics of the business, and every serious border agency knows it. The barrier is not sold as a stopper, it is sold as a clock. It converts an instant crossing into a 12-minute crossing, and 12 minutes is only worth something if someone can get there inside 12 minutes. Which means the barrier is worthless without the agent. And the agent is where the economics turn genuinely ugly. Money buys steel very reliably. Money buys people almost not at all. The American Border Patrol has spent the better part of 2 decades trying to grow, and has repeatedly received funding for thousands of positions it could not fill. The pipeline is the problem. An applicant goes through a written exam, a fitness test, a background investigation, and a polygraph. And during one stretch, roughly 2/3 of applicants failed the polygraph alone. Then comes months of academy training, including Spanish instruction, then field training. The whole process takes the better part of a year, and the fully loaded cost of producing one agent, including recruiting, vetting, academy, salary, and benefits, runs well over $100,000 before that agent has worked an independent shift. Then you have to keep them. The duty stations are in places with no housing market, no spouse employment, no schools worth relocating for, and no reason for a young person to stay after they have a badge and a resume. So you pay retention bonuses of $30,000, you pay relocation, and in some sectors you build housing, because you have discovered that you are not competing with other agencies for these people. You are competing with the entire rest of the country. Every other federal law enforcement job, every police department, and every private security firm is hiring from the same small pool of people who can pass a background check and want to carry a gun for a living. So the ratio that actually determines whether your border works is not dollars per mile, it is agents per mile per shift. Divide a 2,000-mile border by 20,000 agents, subtract everyone in headquarters, training, checkpoints, processing, transport, and administrative duty, then divide what's left across 3 shifts, 7 days, with leave and sick time, and you arrive at a number of bodies actually standing on the line at 3 in the morning that is a small fraction of what the headline force size implies. That is the number the 12 minutes have to fit inside. And when large numbers of families and children arrive and surrender voluntarily, agents leave the line entirely to process them, which means the surge does not defeat the barrier. It defeats the staffing model behind the barrier. Here's where it gets interesting, because this staffing math is exactly what created the modern border technology industry. If you cannot hire the people, you buy machines that make each person cover more ground. Fixed surveillance towers with radar and long-range cameras. Autonomous towers with onboard software that flags movement. Aerostats, ground sensors, drones. The pitch is irresistible. A tower costs a fraction of a mile of wall and watches several miles in every direction, so the cost per mile of coverage collapses. Israeli defense contractors sold integrated fixed towers to the American border. Newer American firms sold autonomous towers with fewer people in the loop. Contracts in the hundreds of millions moved to companies that had never poured a yard of concrete. And the machines work, in the narrow sense. They detect things. That is precisely the problem. A tower generates alerts. Every alert is a cow, a truck on a ranch road, a tumbleweed, a border patrol vehicle, a hiker, a false positive from heat shimmer, or an actual crossing. Somebody has to look at each one, and if it looks real, somebody has to drive out there, and the drive is 40 minutes across broken ground. Government auditors reviewing the surveillance program have repeatedly found the agency could not demonstrate what the towers actually contributed because it never built the measurement into the contracts. So you bought detection and discovered detection is not interdiction. You have converted an invisible problem into a visible problem, and visibility without response capacity is just a more expensive way to know you are losing. Worse, the tower is not a wall. A wall is a capital purchase that sits there rusting slowly. A tower is a service. Software licenses, data links, maintenance contracts, refresh cycles every few years as the sensors go obsolete. The vendors understood something the buyers did not. Selling a barrier is a one-time transaction. Selling awareness is an annuity. Now, here's the other side of the ledger, and it is much bigger than the line itself. Detection and apprehension are the cheap part of enforcement. What happens after the apprehension is where the money actually goes. A person taken into custody has to be transported, housed, fed, given medical care, given a hearing, and either released or removed. Detention runs on the order of $150 to $200 per person per day for adults and considerably more for families, while the supervised alternatives that use check-ins and monitoring run in the single-digit dollars per day. A removal by air is not a commercial ticket. It is a chartered aircraft with a crew and officers escorting, priced by the flight hour, which is why the government's own per-removal estimates have long sat above $10,000 a head before any legal proceedings. And the legal proceedings are the real choke point. An immigration court backlog measured in millions of cases, with average waits of several years, means the physical infrastructure at the line is feeding a judicial system that cannot absorb it. You can double the agents. You cannot double the judges by appropriation because judges take years to hire and courtrooms take years to build, and the backlog compounds while you wait. So the practical result of a very expensive apprehension is very often a release with a court date years out, which is not a policy failure at the border. It is a capacity failure 400 miles inland, and no amount of steel touches it. That is the structure of the spending. Now here is the trap almost nobody sees coming, and it is the single most important thing about this entire business. Enforcement is a price support program for smuggling. Follow the mechanism. In the early 1990s, before the modern build-out, crossing the southern border into the United States was largely a self-service activity. People walked. If they hired a guide, the fee was a few hundred to about $1,000, and the guide was frequently a neighbor from the same town making a side income. It was a competitive, low-barrier, low-margin trade, exactly like any business with no moat. Then enforcement concentrated in the easy urban corridors, San Diego, El Paso, under an explicit strategy of pushing crossings into terrain so hostile it would deter people on its own. It did not deter them. It reorganized them. Crossing the Arizona desert in summer requires water planning, route knowledge, vehicles staged on the far side, and someone who has done it before. That is not a neighbor with a truck. That is a service business with fixed assets and expertise. Watch what that did to the price. Guide fees went from a few $100s to several thousand, and today, the going rate for a Mexican national is commonly in the range of $6,000 to $10,000, with people from further away paying multiples of that, and nationals from other continents paying $20,000 and up for a full package. That is not inflation. That is a 10 to 20-fold real increase in the price of a service, produced entirely by the actions of the enforcing government. Now ask the obvious business question. Who captured that price increase? Not the migrants, who pay it. Not the government, which collects none of it. It went to the only organizations capable of operating a high fixed-cost logistics business under enforcement pressure: organized crime. And once the margins were that good, the criminal organizations that controlled the drug corridors did the rational thing and taxed the traffic running through their territory. Crossing certain stretches now requires payment to whoever controls that ground. A tax collected on people who are already paying a smuggler, with the enforcement of that tax provided by the threat of violence. Estimates of human smuggling revenue flowing to these organizations run from the hundreds of millions into the billions annually. Sit with the full shape of it. You raised your enforcement budget. The higher enforcement raised the price of crossing. The higher price destroyed the amateurs and handed the market to the professionals. The professionals used the profits to buy better vehicles, better tunnels, better corruption, and better intelligence about your patrol patterns. Your enforcement spending is, functionally, the marketing department of your adversary's business model. Every dollar you add makes their product more expensive and their industry more consolidated. There is no version of harder enforcement that does not also make smuggling more profitable. That is not an argument against enforcement. It is the cost line that never appears in any budget document. And the second-order effect is worse, because it inverts the entire objective. Before the build-out, migration across that border was largely circular. People came for a season or a few years, worked, and went home, then came back when they needed to. Decades of research out of Princeton tracking Mexican migrant households documented this pattern in detail. The flow ran in both directions, and the return leg was as large as the arrival leg. The border was expensive to cross in effort but cheap in money, so going home was a reversible decision. Then, crossing started costing $8,000 and carrying a real chance of dying in the desert. Consider what that does to a rational person already inside the country. Going home for Christmas now means paying $8,000 and risking your life to come back. So you do not go home. You bring your family instead, because bringing them once is cheaper than crossing repeatedly. Return migration collapsed, and the population that had been circulating settled permanently. The enforcement did not reduce the number of people inside the country. It trapped them there and converted temporary workers into permanent residents with children who are citizens. If your stated objective was fewer people living inside your borders, you spent enormous sums to achieve the exact opposite, and the mechanism was not corruption or incompetence. It was price theory working correctly. So far, the border sounds like a machine that fails at its job. It is worse than that. It is often aimed at the wrong perimeter entirely. Roughly 40% of the unauthorized population of the United States never crossed a border illegally at all. They arrived at an airport with a valid visa, were inspected and admitted by an officer, and simply stayed after it expired. For years now, more people have joined the unauthorized population by overstaying a legal admission than by crossing between ports of entry. A barrier in the Sonoran Desert has precisely zero effect on a person who lands at an international airport, and no amount of money spent on that barrier ever will. The drug flow tells the same story with sharper numbers. The overwhelming majority of fentanyl seized at the American southern border is seized at official ports of entry, the legal crossings with lanes and booths and inspection, not on the open desert. And the large majority of people convicted of trafficking it across are United States citizens, driving legally through those lanes. Fentanyl is potent enough that a supply worth millions fits in a vehicle's door panel. It does not need a smuggler through the brush. It needs a car with a legitimate driver and a lane, which is the one thing every barrier design deliberately leaves open. Then there's the demand side of the labor market, which is the true engine of the entire flow and is essentially untouched. Worksite enforcement in the United States has been minuscule relative to the size of the employer base, and the penalties for hiring unauthorized workers have historically been small enough to function as a cost of doing business rather than a deterrent. Entire sectors, meatpacking, agriculture, construction, hospitality, elder care, are structurally dependent on this labor, and their wage offers are the reason the whole market exists. You are spending tens of billions to interdict a supply while leaving the demand signal broadcasting at full strength. That is the structural comedy of the ledger. The three largest inputs to the problem, overstays, ports of entry, and employer demand, are the three cheapest things to address, and they receive a fraction of the money. And the money spent at the line has an opportunity cost that lands directly on your own economy. The land ports on the Southern American border move something on the order of $800 billion a year in trade. Those same ports are chronically short of inspection officers because officers get funded and hired far more slowly than agents in green. The result is wait times, and wait times are money. Studies of border crossing delays have put the annual cost to economic output in the billions of dollars, because a truck idling on a bridge is a factory in Michigan waiting on a part and a warehouse in Texas paying a driver to sit. Border cities themselves live on that traffic. Retail economies in the border metros depend heavily on shoppers crossing from the other side, and every measure that thickens the border thins those towns. So a policy that slows the legal crossings in order to look serious about the illegal ones taxes the exact American communities that have to live there, while doing nothing to the desert 200 miles east. You are not choosing between security and openness. You are choosing which of your own citizens absorbs the bill. Here's where the international economics get genuinely clever, because at some point, every wealthy government figures out the same thing. The cheapest border to enforce is somebody else's. Europe worked this out early. Its border agency began in the mid-2000s with a budget of a few million euros and grew into an organization with hundreds of millions annually and a mandate to build a standing corps of 10,000 personnel. But the far bigger spending never appeared on that agency's budget at all. It went into agreements with the countries in between, a multi-billion euro package to Turkey to hold migrants, funding and equipment for Libyan and North African coastal forces, development money and visa arrangements with Sahel states, and a long list of payments to Morocco. The border being enforced is 1,000 miles from Europe and is operated by people Europe does not employ. The United States runs the same play. In 2019, under the threat of escalating tariffs, Mexico deployed tens of thousands of newly formed National Guard troops to its own northern and southern borders. That is an enormous enforcement capacity acquired without a single American appropriation, purchased with trade leverage instead of money. Australia went furthest, processing asylum seekers on Pacific Islands at a per-person annual cost that ran into the millions of dollars when occupancy fell. One of the most expensive per capita policies any democracy has ever run, and defended on the grounds that the deterrent value justified it. Externalization works, and it is cheaper per unit than anything you can build yourself. But it has a structural flaw that every buyer eventually discovers. You have converted a domestic infrastructure problem into a foreign policy dependency. The buffer state now holds an asset you need and can reprice at will. The payment renews. The leverage compounds in their direction because the moment they stop, your border problem reappears on television within weeks. That is not a wall. That is a lease on someone else's cooperation. And the landlord knows exactly what the property is worth to you. So where is the real money in border security? Follow the same rule that works in every other industry. Find the recurring revenue. It is not in the barrier. A barrier is a one-time capital job, and once it is built, the contractor goes home. The durable money is in everything that renews, the detention capacity paid by the day, the transport flights paid by the hour, the biometric and identity systems paid by the license, the surveillance towers paid by the service contract, the case management software, the data integration, the maintenance. This is why the composition of the industry shifted from construction firms to technology and services firms. The construction companies were selling an object. The technology companies figured out how to sell a permanent operating expense with a renewal clause. And that is why this budget only moves in one direction. American border and immigration enforcement spending went from roughly $1.5 billion in the early 1990s to tens of billions today, with a 2025 package adding tens of billions more for barrier construction and detention capacity on top of the annual base. Through recessions, through periods when crossings fell to historic lows, through administrations of both parties, the line goes up. Not because anyone concluded it was working, because a border enforcement budget is a rare thing in government, an expenditure whose failure is always evidence that it was underfunded. If crossings rise, you need more. If crossings fall, it proves the spending works and must be protected. There is no data that reduces it, which is exactly why the vendors, the contractors, the rural counties whose largest employer is a detention facility, and the unions representing the officers all form a constituency for a permanent, growing number. The measurable output is not migration. The measurable output is the appropriation. So look at what you actually purchased. You wanted a line, and you got a system. A rusting steel asset with an eternal maintenance bill. A workforce you cannot hire fast enough to use it. A court system 400 miles inland that is the real bottleneck. A smuggling industry your own spending capitalized. A settled population your own spending created. And a set of foreign governments who now hold a recurring claim on your treasury. None of this means a country cannot control its border. Countries do it. But the ones that actually move the numbers do it by working on the things that have no photograph. Employer verification that has teeth. Ports of entry staffed and equipped to inspect a fraction more of what moves through them. Visa systems that track departures as carefully as arrivals. Courts funded to decide cases in months rather than years. And legal channels priced low enough that the smuggler cannot compete. Every one of those is cheaper per unit of effect than a mile of steel. Not one of them can be pointed at from a helicopter. The demand for a controlled border is real. It is not manufactured, it is not irrational, and no country that has lost the ability to say who enters stays a functioning country for long. That truth does not go away because the spending is inefficient, and the economics are perverse. Enforcement raises the price of the thing it forbids, and the profit goes to the worst people in the transaction. Hardening the line converts visitors into residents. The most expensive infrastructure addresses the smallest share of the flow, and the cheapest fixes are the ones nobody can stand in front of. Both of those are true at the same time, and every serious government has to hold them together. The ones that only hold the first build monuments and wonder why the numbers don't move. The ones that only hold the second lose the public and eventually lose the policy entirely. The border is not a construction project with a price per mile. It is a market you are trying to price out of existence, and the only real question is whether you are willing to spend where the market actually is, or only where the cameras are.